The girl from the reception desk, Nicole, told the pediatrician on duty. "Miss Roberts, a new call has come in. A 4-year-old child with a high temperature." The doctor asked her, "Nicole, I ended half an hour ago. I'll just finish the cards and go home, and you can find someone else." She spent the whole day on her feet and wanted only one thing: to get home as soon as possible and rest. 10 minutes later, Nicole again came to Mrs. Roberts. "Sorry, there is no one else. Mrs. Helms had twisted her leg, and therefore she can't go and asks you to replace her. I called the rest. They are on calls and will not be able to come there." And the girl looked imploringly at the doctor. The woman only sighed in response. "Okay, Nicole, say the name and address." The girl was delighted. "Thank you. Now I will write out a form for a call and bring it to you." After which she ran away. She soon returned. "I told Jack to take you where you need to go. Get ready." On the way, Mrs. Roberts unfolded the completed form and began to study it in surprise. She thought to herself, "John David Roberts, amazing name match." She was married to David Roberts for more than 10 years, but they never had children. They silently arrived at the indicated address, and the doctor climbed the stairs to the second floor. She was met by a young man whose face for some reason seemed familiar to Mrs. Roberts. The woman led her down the corridor to the children's room. A pale, dark-haired boy was lying in bed. Mrs. Roberts smiled. "Hello, Paul. How are you?" Then she turned to the boy's mother. "What is he complaining about?" The woman said, as she watched the door listen to the child. "He has been coughing for the second day, and today the temperature jumped sharply to 38.5. Mrs. Roberts carefully felt the patient. "I need to look at his throat." She asked the woman. "The lymph nodes are slightly enlarged. Can you bring a clean tablespoon?" She replied, "Now." Then she called someone. "Darling, can you bring me a clean tablespoon? Paul needs to see her throat." Literally a few seconds later, a man in a kitchen apron entered and handed a spoon to Mrs. Roberts. The doctor froze in place, meeting his eyes. Her own husband, David Roberts, looked at her in complete confusion, who yesterday told her that he was leaving today on a business trip for 3 days. Mrs. Roberts shuddered in surprise, took a spoon and carefully examined the child, explaining to her parents what they needed to do. The doctor said in a perfectly calm voice, "I'm going to give him a prescription now. If the temperature doesn't drop in the next 2 days, he will have to take injections. Be sure to drink plenty of warm water and ventilate the room more often. It's very stuffy here." She sat down at the table, quickly wrote out a prescription for medicines, said goodbye and left. As soon as the woman crossed the threshold of her apartment, her husband began to call her. Mrs. Roberts dropped the call all the time. She sat in complete prostration, remembering the past evening. How so? Could it be that her husband David had lied to her so calmly all these years? She really wanted children, but for some reason she didn't succeed. So the problem was in her, since her husband had a child with another woman. David himself arrived the next morning. He lowered his guilty head when he saw his wife's impassive face. Then he looked at her. "Julia, I've long wanted to tell you." But she stopped him with a wave of her hand. She asked him, "Why? Can you just tell me one thing? Why have you been lying to me all these years?" David said, "I couldn't tell you. I loved you, but I also love the mother of my child. You and I have not had children for so many years." It turned out that during the next corporate party, David drank a lot of alcohol and began to flirt with his new colleague Becky. After the party, both went to her place, and the faithful husband stayed there for the night. In the morning, he came up with an excuse that he fell asleep at a friend's as he was very drunk. Soon, Becky told him that she was expecting a child from him, and David suddenly realized that he had long wanted this. He could neither leave his wife nor part with the mother of his future baby. He received a promotion and told Julia that he could go on business trips more often. Since then, he began to live in 2 families, carefully hiding his second life from his wife. When Julia listened to his story, she was silent for a long time, and then she herself suggested, "I know that the child is not to blame for anything. I know that you dreamed about it for a long time, but we didn't succeed. I agreed to divorce. They need you, and I can't live with you anymore after all this. I release you on all 4 sides." David was delighted and didn't hide it. He began to thank her, but his wife no longer listened to him. She reminded him, "You are expected. Your son has a fever. You must bring him medicine." The husband quickly gathered his things and left. Julia calmly closed the door behind him, and then when his steps subsided, she threw a vase, which was on the nightstand in the hallway, against the wall with a wild cry. Long-held resentment and anger at her husband for his betrayal covered the woman with her head. She rushed around the kitchen like a fury, destroying everything that came to her hand. Julia stopped only when she heard a demanding call at the door. The woman opened the door. A tall, burly, middle-aged man dressed in a police uniform stood in the doorway. Surprise appeared on his face at the sight of the hostess. He asked her incredulously, "Mrs. Roberts, did you make such a rumble?" The woman in turn was surprised. "Do we know each other?" The policeman replied, "Yes, I recently brought a baby to the hospital for examination. Do you remember? Newborn baby found in a box near the grocery store, almost frozen to death. It's good that he was found in time." Mrs. Roberts remembered. "Exactly. Then they took him to an orphanage. Yes, now I recognize you." The man told her, continuing to stand on the threshold. "The neighbors called us. They said that terrible screams and some kind of roar are coming from your apartments. What happened to you?" Julia was embarrassed. "Life's trouble had a bad effect on my nerves." The policeman carefully looked at the woman. "I had it too." Julia realized herself. "Come in. Why are you standing on the threshold?" The man entered and immediately saw the broken vase. Julia smiled nervously, following his gaze. "In the kitchen, things are even worse. This is the source of the noise that the neighbors complained about." She felt that, for some unknown reason, she could trust this calm man with a reasonable look. Julia invited him into the living room and brought a tray of tea and cookies. "I can only offer you this if you are not in a hurry." She handed the guest a cup. The policeman, who introduced himself as Tom, didn't forget the purpose of his visit. "What happened to you?" Julia mechanically answered. "Yesterday, I found out that my husband lives with another woman, and they have a child. The boy got sick. I was called to help him." Tom did not finish. "And you?" The woman chuckled mirthlessly. "I made a prescription without showing that I was shocked that my husband, who had gone on a business trip, ended up in the patient's house. He came here to explain himself to me, but I had nothing to discuss. I told him I was letting him go, and then I freaked out. Then you showed up." Tom shook his head thoughtfully. "I understand you perfectly. I went through it myself." Julia listened to her new acquaintance with interest and sympathy. Tom raised his son, not suspecting that his wife had given birth to another man. The truth came out when the boy needed blood for surgery. Tom was ready to give blood, but tests showed that he and his son didn't match in all respects. The wife eventually admitted that the father is another man. The man divorced her, and she left for another city, taking the boy with her. Since then, Tom has not heard anything about them. For the past 3 years, the servant of the law has been in the status of a divorced, which is not particularly burdensome. They talked for almost 2 hours. Julia jumped up in surprise when Nicole from the reception called her. "Good morning, Mrs. Roberts. The boss is nervous. We have a meeting in 30 minutes, and you're still not here. What happened to you?" "Oh my God, I completely forgot. I'm on my way." Julia, in a panic, began to get ready for work. She explained to Tom's surprised look. "I should be at work in half an hour, but instead, I arranged a morning here with heartbreaking stories. I'll be late, and the boss will kill me today." The policeman suggested to her, getting up from his car, "I can give you a ride." They jumped into the car and drove off. Tom turned on the flasher. Julia showed up at the hospital 5 minutes before the meeting. After work, Tom, dressed in civilian clothes, met Julia. He smiled affably. "I want to offer you my help in eliminating the consequences of the morning's debacle." Julia was embarrassed. "I completely forgot. I'm in such a mess. You'd better not see it." However, Tom did not listen to her, opening the door to the car. "Mrs. Roberts, I live alone, and my picture is worse even without such excess." When they put the apartment in order and Tom threw out the trash, he invited Julia to have dinner at a small cafe on the embankment. There was something insanely attractive about this man that made her forget her troubles. They chatted until dark, arguing and discussing, and also laughing to tears at some nonsense from films and jokes. A couple of months later, Julia signed a divorce document with an indifferent look. Tom called her the next day after that. "Do you want to visit someone?" Julia was surprised when Tom brought her to the orphanage and showed her a chubby baby who was studying toys with a concentrated look. "Admire, this is our found baby." Julia watched the child with a smile. "How he has grown." Tom and Julia began to visit the boy and play with him. Tom suggested after the next visit unexpectedly for the woman. I thought that he should be adopted. It's not the boy's fault that he was born to the wrong parents. Julia thought. Adopt, but it's not easy to do it alone. Tom excitingly said, That's what I'm talking about. We've both had misfortunes, so let's make it so that there is one more loving family. You and me and our baby. Will you marry me? For some time, Julia silently looked at his expressive face and then whispered, Yes! A few months later, Tom was returning from a walk with a baby, and Julia met him, on whose face a mysterious smile played. She only smiled happily at her husband's questions, but said nothing. Finally, the woman whispered, seeing Tom's concern, We will have a baby. Tom and Julia had a daughter on the day when Randy was 2 years old.